Deceleration.news. We're reflecting back on 2025 and thinking about the year ahead. Thanks for joining us. We'll take good care of you. Thank you for joining us. I'm Greg Harman at Deceleration, and I have a couple of updates for you this week. A couple of conversations I'm excited to share. Just reflecting a lot about the Deceleration project, where we've been. It's 10 years now. Strangely, hard to believe. But reflecting a lot on this last year, a lot has happened, and on the needs of the year ahead of us, which are yawning, right? And so I wanted to invite Marisol Cortez, our executive editor, in to have a conversation and just think about what deceleration is, what it means in this moment. My hope is that we can carry with us collectively appropriate levels of curiosity, outrage, love, rebellion, and passion to host just a few of the necessary conversations going into 2026. On this podcast, talking with Marisol Cortez about this year behind, the year ahead, and the challenges and opportunities for a curious project like Deceleration in this time. But stick around for after that 20 or 25-minute conversation. We'll be meeting our contributing writer, Syris Valentine, who has agreed to step up and lead a monthly newsletter at Deceleration dedicated to alternative futures. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about what that means in practice. We will continue to show up and do our best to be there as we are needed, to reject, mock, and scorn the very notion of legitimacy for those demanding one kind of human experience, one belief, one complexion, or single-minded oppression. While we will insist over and again on a world as we've inspired by our relatives, our family a few hundred miles to the south, on one world where many worlds fit. So first, deceleration updates with Marisol.
I think that we knew moving from 2024 to 2025 that things were going to shift in terms of how, at the very least, how people were going to be organizing or going to have to be organizing. We didn't know exactly what shape that would take, but I think nobody was surprised by, at least we weren't surprised by the developments, the political developments in the political landscape this year, as they've impacted Deceleration as a publishing and writing project, but also as they've just impacted our neighborhood and our neighbors and our community, the communities that we're part of. They're pretty much doing everything they said they were going to do. So
You're talking about the regime.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And we did a lot of moving into 2025 at the beginning of the year, we very intentionally did a lot of internal planning.
Right.
We did a lot of community planning. We hosted house meetings just very informally, after the election, in the time between the election and the inauguration. In that window of time, we gathered with community members just informally to support each other, but also do planning and scenario planning, anticipating that we would be facing some of the situations that we're now facing. I think that it's been one thing to sort of anticipate it, and then another thing to actually be you kind of realize that there was a lot that you kind of couldn't anticipate in even if you could anticipate it sort of abstractly, like until it started happening, like it
like
was
the daily reality would become one where getting a random message, hey, my friend's daughter is a U.S. citizen, which is snatched at the Pearl, down the street or across the river or whatever,
across the tracks.
It's just our daily lives is different.
Yeah.
For sure.
Or, I mean, I think one of the things that was like pretty chilling for me was when one of our funders, which has historically supported like progressive organizations in Texas specifically, organized a training for all of their grantees on how do you prepare for an IRS audit. I mean, it was a very like visceral coming to awareness of like what it would mean for, I mean, like we felt it right away. Like I remember after the election, we were part of a, just in terms of sort of like the nonprofit world or the world of like organizations, whether they're nonprofits or not. After the election, even then, we were seeing some impacts where we had been part of a group that submitted a huge, like, it took like, I mean, I think people worked on this grant for like 2 years together, like 7 organizations here locally, to apply for EPA funding that was being made available under the IRA, specifically for like environment, to channel funds, federal funds to environmental justice work, specifically
doing climate adaptation efforts. Yeah.
Right. And so we collaborated with a number of other groups on that grant, and labored for months on it. It was huge. Like if anyone's applied for federal grants, it's like, it's kind of, they're really intense. And so we submitted it like shortly before the election, and then the election happened. For a while, for a few weeks, there was hope that like the EPA was going to be in the last months of the Biden administration was going to be able to like move all that funding to organizations that had applied quickly. And then in January, I mean, it just kind of like evaporated for us, just in terms of like, as a nonprofit organization, publishing project, there was sort of like shifts in the funding landscape. And then there were also like these clear signs that the regime was moving towards like more direct kinds of repression of speech they don't like, and organizations that publish and that engage in that kind of speech. So, I mean, I think we had questions at the beginning of the year, like how are we going to need to shift what we do in the way that we do it, that really like didn't become like we kept trying to think through it, and it felt like we couldn't in a concrete way until things started happening. And now I feel like stuff has become clear. Like, oh well, I guess there's just not it's not funding anymore, or like
well, I think one of the things for Deceleration was really like in terms of as a project, and in terms of a business, right, that we were always kind of like overextended in one area, and the challenge today and has been for a long time is building a media project that people support at a basic level, that coverage, information, analysis, reporting is worth $5 a month, and it's always been a challenge that we've got to bring up our membership. We've got to explore advertising relationships that we were very, very cautious about before, and obviously just made that more clear that, we have to explore alternative funding areas, but I don't want to get bogged down on funding. It's the least interesting thing about what we do.
Yeah, no, but I'll just say, like, the other thing, just to say on the back end, and I think maybe you talked about this in your conversation with Syris too, is just that, like, the collapse of Obamacare. I mean, Obamacare makes it possible for many writers and artists and people that work independently to...
It may have saved my life in 2013, so...
It did.
Yeah.
I mean, for disabled people, for people that had pre-existing health conditions, but also for, like, a lot of people that freelance, people that, like, are part of the gig economy, people that have independent projects like this, like... that's how you can have a basic standard of living, is to be able to get insurance through Obamacare. And when that kind of like went away, I mean, we still have it, but under like shittier conditions than
like
ever.
4 times the cost.
It's not that. I mean, it's gone up, but more than that, like options have just like there's very few options that are affordable anymore. But when that went away, like it really, it changes. Okay, like we're gonna have to organize the project internally differently than we have been able to do under conditions that were more life affirming.
Well, before we go, we went kind of into the deep dark cellar, like straight out of the gate. Let's talk about, like, literally think about the year and what we were able to accomplish.
Oh, sure.
And like the stories that were like, wow, this never would have seen the light of day. People wouldn't know who this was or what this was, or, like how they can actively change and make the world better, even under stress, you know, and all the stress that we're under.
Yeah, like I will say that, like, so that was, one of the things that was happening in 2025. The other thing that I'll say about the year is just like, I'm super grateful to like have survived just physically. And I went through a lot of health problems in the early part of the year, that I was able to come out of. And one thing that I am really proud of, like, is that in spite of the, really intense, like, political challenges, in spite of the really intense, like, personal difficulties, we continued to publish. Like we didn't let up, and like you did you were the sole person publishing in those months that I was in the hospital. But we also had like a number of, I think we worked with like 25, 30 contributing writers.
Yeah.
Really talented writers from mostly in Texas, but other places too. And that allowed us to cover, expand our coverage, like geographically, regionally, thematically, topically. So that's something I'm proud of. It's just that we survived and we persisted. Yeah,
I think about deceleration, and it's hard. It's to really grapple with this, but I mean, this is 10 years, right? So deceleration has been based in San Antonio, working in different ways for 10 years. We've been a nonprofit for 5. We've been a nonprofit organization for half that time. And I was talking with someone yesterday that, I mean, for a lot of media projects, I've seen many come and go in Texas, right? In this time that we've been here, and certainly since my time in San Antonio in 2007. And oftentimes they come in and they have a really healthy budget, and they've got a full staff, and they've got really good looking graphics, and they're doing great reporting. But they're built on the need to have this big block of money at behind them. And oftentimes that's going to be corporate money or grant money. And I think what's been different, our trajectory has been very, very slow, and very low.
True to our name.
To lift off, right? To where we are today, where we're going to be, launching, 4 or 5 newsletters, a new website with Ghost, all kinds of new plans and work. But I think part of that slow liftoff was like, I never wanted to pull people in and kind of like challenge them to give labor for free. So we didn't have the contributing writing base that we have today. And it's kind of amazing to have that many folks that we've been able to work with, gain the expert, the benefit of their knowledge, their energy, their passion, and be able to pay them, right? That's been such a gift, I think, for us as well,
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you're asking about stories, and I made some notes. I mean, I think like the stories that I'm proudest of for this year, I mean, I started the series last year, but then the 2 pieces that came out at the beginning, about a year ago, about Jessica Witzel, and her death during a heat dome event in August 2024. I'll always be like really proud of that work. Not just because she was somebody that I knew from childhood, and writing about her felt like a way that I could like honor her life, but also because I think we did some things that like I always think when I'm like, what is the writing that only I can do? Or what is the writing that only we can do? What is the writing that, or the research that, like, if we didn't do it, nobody would do it, right? And that story felt like one of those times, to get her autopsy report and see the way that her death was constructed as a drug overdose when her body temperature was 126 degrees when she died, or shortly thereafter anyway. And not just in that case, but you realize then that that there's a pattern, right? That what we're seeing is probably not isolated to her case or to Albert's case, but is part of a bigger problem, and feel like you had a tiny hand in exposing that pattern. And I think that we continue to, like, that story has continued to resonate, right? In terms of, and there were developments that happened at the city level and the county level that I don't think that they would have happened if we hadn't written about Jessica and about Albert, and continued to write about them and continued to follow the story of like extreme heat in San Antonio as like one of the kind of like main front lines of how we're feeling the impacts of climate change here. And it's really among a community that like nobody gives a shit about, right? And so it becomes invisibilized. And I know you wrote some pieces later in the year where you've continued to track sort of the movement of city and county of public response to that as a public health emergency. So like later in the year, like you were able to really quickly cover like the city council's consideration of, I can't even remember.
It was a CCR to begin actually just to commit themselves to tracking heat mortality, like
researching how to even change how that data is collected, which has to come through the county actually, and not the city. But how do you update the forms to reflect like this new like reality that we're living in, where you have to be able to have some mechanism for like describing on the death certificate, is this related to extreme weather, right? To capture the public health dimensions of climate. So that's one that I was really proud of for myself. I think for in terms of like your work, the story that you did about kind of local neighborhood-based climate resilience work that's continuing in spite of federal hostility to any kind of climate action at all, and even an intensification of extraction and combustion and the fossil fuels. I think that's like we always have the pull to write about to expose the things that are fucked up. And we always have to sort of like intentionally counter that in our own tendencies, personally and as a project. Like, and I think that
just spend time with people who are investing in doing things differently, right? It's not reflex for me always. And I agree. And that's, we're going to talk on this podcast with Syris Valentine, and one of the new newsletters that we're launching is Alternative Futures, which is completely dedicated to that idea.
Yeah. And then just in terms of things that I really liked from our contributing writers, that I remember, that I'm proud of, that we were able to publish. I really liked Kit O'Connell's story. Over the summer, the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, which is one of my trade organizations, had their conference, and I didn't attend in person, but I did the virtual part of the conference, and we had dispatched some contributing writers to that conference space, and Kit attended a panel about I want to say like queer and trans, like climate fiction, basically. But the way that they tied it, like, so they were covering the panel, right, which was just like, academics reading papers, but they tied one of the papers in particular, which was about a Polish queer women's environmental collective called Sister Rivers, I want to say. Kit tied the topic of the panel to like an incident of transphobic violence that happened in Austin last summer.
At Barton Springs.
And so I thought just did like a really beautiful job of like really making the stakes of some of those more like academic conversations like very vivid for people.
Yeah, and I thought for me as a reader too, just the idea then to tie back around to the project, of creating alternative futures, is a life or death project for a lot of people and a lot of communities. So, I think, that was a good example of that.
Yeah, I thought I was really happy that we were able to publish, and this just came through like my inbox as a, like person sending this out to his email list, but that we were able to publish Arturo Madrid's call to action to Latinx academics and writers and artists and cultural workers as a community voices piece. I thought Frances Madison did some really amazing book reviews, and I also really liked the podcast that we did towards the end of the year with the I'm blanking on his name, but he's with the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. That was really cool. Kind of their reflections back on the COP 30. But then also that we branched out into creative work. We published our first creative review, and had submissions mostly from folks locally, but they were like, it was a short turnaround, but people submitted like amazing.
Well, and that was on the topic work that people are become quickly animated on for good reason, and that's ice, right? And so it was a dual, reflection on that, or play on words was, melting the ice and vanishing ice,
and vanishing neighbors.
Yeah, vanishing glacier, yeah.
And we have another creative review coming sometime this month, which is about coral reefs and oceans, and we've gotten a lot of really great submissions to that from Texas and beyond, which is cool. And then just lastly, a couple more pieces I wanted to mention. I'm sorry. I loved Seba's music video that you and Seba Ili did called Sunak.
About the right to migrate, essentially. Yeah.
But it was shot. Y'all shot it in Brackenridge Park at the Blue Hole. It's beautiful. If people haven't seen it,
I'll put that in the show notes.
And I told her that I would watch that like all the time in the hospital, and it would remind me of home. And I also really liked that we were able to highlight the Philippine martial law exhibit and panel that happened in November here at a community gallery. I thought that was really an important set of lessons for what we're facing, what we're looking down the barrel of right now. And so we're always, I think looking for examples of what other communities and places and times, what have they done to survive and to organize.
Yeah,
these
the world is
conditions.
not low on examples of people being suffering and the violence of authoritarian, autocratic regimes, unfortunately, to this day. But also, because of that, so many lessons to be pulled in. And I know that was something that you really foregrounded and set up for folks when we were having our house meetings at the beginning of the year. I think for myself, this has been a year of marches. Quickly, all of the No Kings marches, and we've been out and been at most of them. We have a lot of photographic and video documentation of that, and I think that's been so important because it calls people in. It gives people say, okay, no, people aren't just sitting around, even though if the Democratic Party or this, that, the other thing, we know that people are active and we can meet them, right? We could come out into the street and meet them. So I think all of that work has been really satisfying, and certainly some of the writers that you mentioned and some that have yet to be, but like Gage Davila writing from the coast on all the constant struggle and over the petrochemical build out and LNG. I thought Syris Valentine story about what's the end game. We've written a number of things about SpaceX, and Gage did a great one about how it's changing the community and the culture there around Boca Chica and Brownsville along the lower coast. But Syris looked at it from a purely like, what is this going to do to the atmosphere? What is it going to do to our climate? And if you look at how many hundreds of these launches are planned, ultimately, every year, it's going to have a devastating impact. So I thought, some of the research and Wendy's story, Wendy Nicole did a series of stories about big cats and borderland, wilderness conservation and wildlife biodiversity. And I thought those were great stories. So moving forward, I don't know if you have things that you're top of mind or if you want to get into that.
I'm excited. So even though we've seen sort of the vise turned on nonprofits, especially progressive nonprofits, I think that some of the pathways that have become clear in that process are also exciting to me. I've thought for a long time, how do you, how do we start a co-op? How do we start a community land trust? How do we start, when we were organizing and writing about mission trails, how do you have a resident ownership option for people? How do you, I've been interested in a long time in sort of alternative economies models, and so some of the things that excite me about the shifts that we're that are underway in Deceleration as a publishing project or as on the back end, right? As a business model would be moving more in the direction of away from a traditional nonprofit, which is sort of top down, and toward a more horizontally organized, worker self-directed nonprofit. That's really interesting to me. Mm-hmm. That excites me, the possibility that we could create something like that maybe over the long term. And also, it is bringing more writers in, that's exciting. And some of that has been of necessity, we've had to shift to more away from more kind of web-based publishing to like a newsletter model, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we are maybe days, maybe a week on the outside away from launching a new website. That will be, along with that, will be 3 or 4 newsletters. They'll be new and they'll be curated by correspondents, reporting back to community on issues like, we talked about the lower coast and the petrochemical build out and struggles, in that part of the world. Syris's newsletter on alternative futures, interviewing folks from around the country and around the world on projects that they're doing today, to show us, all other ways that we can organize ourselves and ways of being that are oftentimes look just plain more pleasurable to me. Roxana is coming in to lift off a monthly newsletter dedicated to ICE and human rights and immigration. And then I'll be doing more writing on power. Well, it's going to be called Water and Power, a newsletter about energy production, data centers, AI, water, riverways, those topics that every year more and more readers tell us they want to know more about water. They want to know more about, the data centers and those relationships.
And I'll be continuing to edit and I'll be teaching part-time at UTSA, for doing some creative writing classes there. And then I'll still be with Deceleration part-time, and my particular contributions will be editing the quarterly creative review during the school year, and then over the summer have a newsletter as well that's sort of like a roundup of like eco-justice, humanities, and arts. So kind of like what I was describing in terms of what Kit did, kind of like really what are the big ideas coming out of conversations among environmental justice thinkers and scholars and writers and artists, and making those accessible and relevant to people's kind of like everyday lives and organizing.
Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the other shifts that folks will recognize pretty quickly is our reinvestment of a lot of our energy into our other platforms, whether it's YouTube or, some of the social channels, realizing that, the web traffic is part of it. But so much of this, even those social channels are kind of, the newsletters are important because the billionaires are controlling the algorithms, exactly. Right? So we have to have email, direct, email is our way through that. But also recognizing that readers are becoming, it's harder to spend the time doing deep reading sometimes. And so having the same concepts and ideas either, directly related to, into the community space by video, or, other forms of media.
Print.
We're going to be exploring that.
Possibility of a print.
Oh yeah.
Media,
looking at maybe a quarterly print product. So
that would be more neighborhood based.
That would be amazing too.
That would be awesome.
And that way you can really look at, the poetry, the photography, the illustrations. Yeah.
Yeah. Support your local grassroots publishing.
Yeah, this will be the test. And definitely we'll be stretching to try to meet the moment. And I think that was something we learned when, the 140 or so folks were grabbed up off of San Pedro and the north side of San Antonio, and all the organizing that's happening in response to what we're seeing, not just in other cities anymore, but increasingly here in San Antonio, that we have to be responsive to that as well, because this is the year that will kind of determine the world that we get, at least for a while.
The last thing I'll say is just like how important I think it is, and how lucky I feel to be like publishing, to be writing. I think those activities are so important. Art making, publishing, like putting your work out there, putting other people's work out there, like are some of the most critical forms of resistance that we have, that human societies have in these kinds of moments. And so I'm always proud that that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Could never forget everything that's actually possible, and it flows through our imaginations, it throws through our analysis, throws through our artwork and through our body. So,
And publishing.
yeah. And publishing. All right. Thank you.
Syris Valentine describes himself over at Just Progress as an essayist, journalist, and fiction writer obsessed with exploring solutions that lay at the foundation for a transformative approach to climate action. He has written on climate funding models for deceleration, also about SpaceX and the damages to our atmosphere, and most recently wrote a story some of you all probably caught on the underappreciated hazards of CO2 pipelines. Here to talk more about that work, his motivations, his development as a journalist, and his plans for alternative futures.
Okay. So I'm on with Syris Valentine, one of our kind of, I don't know what to say, longstanding, but we've been working with you for over a year, I feel like, and I was hoping to just talk with you a little bit about the work that we've done together, allow you a chance to introduce yourself sort of in this podcast setting to readers, and then we're going to be announcing, a new newsletter project. So, firstly, so you wrote most recently on this story on the CO2 pipelines, the hazards they involve. Folks in Texas hopefully are fairly familiar. We have a robust network of those pipelines that are feeding not even so much climate mitigation projects, but they're sucking up the dregs in the oil patch, right? And I know this is not your first story on that subject, that you write a lot about what some folks in kind of organizing spaces might call false solutions. I would say, and I don't necessarily use that term, but these, I would say, challenges in climate mitigation landscape and risks, like real risks that they bring, who wins, who loses, and all of that. So I don't know if you want to maybe just share a little bit about that story and what attracted you to it in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with this story about specifically the sort of pipeline side of carbon capture projects, wherever and whatever destination that carbon dioxide ends up going towards, as you mentioned, a lot of it is used for what's called enhanced oil recovery, where you're just pumping high pressure carbon dioxide into those oil wells to get up that last dregs and drops of oil that are hard to access, which is sort of what ended up sort of prolonging and avoiding peak oil back in like the 80s and 90s. But yeah, what attracted me to this particular story was the incident in Satartia, Mississippi, back in February 2020, where there was this like huge rupture at a pipeline that created this like sort of massive crater that was like 40 feet deep on one side. And that had this huge cloud of carbon dioxide, around like 31,000 barrels of CO2 estimated were like sort of dumped on this like really small hamlet, little village in rural Mississippi called Satartia. And I'd been sort of tracking that story when it happened, and I didn't have much to add at the time back in 2020 and sort of as it was developing. But then I think it was late 2023, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, released their report on the
That really
pipeline.
rolls off the tongue, right? Some of these,
Yeah,
some of these agencies. All right,
I
come on.
always have to remember the actual acronym. But yeah, when that report came out, there were some, stories that sort of added context and sort of showed what was in there. But when I read through it, I noticed that like in all the covers that I'd read, they overlooked the fact that one of the sort of key findings in the report was that Denbury, the pipeline owner, had done modeling on what might happen in the event of a failure. And all of their modeling said that Satartia would never be affected. Like that was a key finding from their modeling.
Wow.
And so as a result of that, they didn't do any like preparatory work with first responders in Satartia, in and around Satartia, to know what would happen and how they would respond in the event of this failure. So then when it happened in February, they were just totally unprepared. No one really knew what was happening. And in the like grand timeline of things, like they also didn't tell first responders in the area for like an hour or more after the incident happened. And there were already reports coming in from people actually living in the area. And so it was just crazy that their modeling could be so wrong for what actually happened in reality.
And
And
I
that's
think,
really,
yeah, and folks really, I mean, have very little a history, right?
yeah,
With these sorts of these pipelines don't rupture all the time. It's kind of it's definitely a rare event, but the risk of it is something like people don't know about. Like, how does CO2 behave when it's
for
released in the
sure.
environment like this, right? That's
Yeah.
a creeping asphyxiation, as you described in the story, right?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, when you have like an oil rupture, especially on land, like it doesn't go very far. Like it might go 100 yards, and that's like an extreme
If
case.
it's not a
Or
water based,
exactly.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, whereas like with carbon dioxide, because it's a gas and because when you have it in the pipeline, it's really high pressure, and it's moving as a fluid, but then when it ruptures, the pipeline breaks, all that pressure is released and it fucking just explodes outwards and can move super far downhill. Like I think Satartia was like a mile away from the pipeline. But yeah, then folks aren't familiar with like what can happen. And so like there were so many cases where it leads to this asphyxiation because it's heavier than air, so it just sinks and hugs to the ground and displaces oxygen up. So like if you have this cloud of carbon dioxide coming in, you're not going to be able to breathe, or at least breathing is going to get very difficult. It's going to cause headaches and disorientation and whatnot. And like in very, very extreme cases, which thankfully wasn't the case in Satartia, like it can literally kill you. Um, in a very like frankly gruesome way. But there were even incidents in this sort of incident around Satartia where people like passed out and just like went totally unconscious because they were just like overcome with this. And thankfully, like those people were able to eventually get out and go to the hospital and sort of get some treatment. But yeah, they're fairly uncommon, like compared to, especially compared to like oil and natural gas infrastructure. I can't remember the specific sort of data points on like the relative incident of
Folks
accidents
can go in
occurring
and find. We'll
thousands.
link that in the show notes for sure. But I think
Yeah.
the kind of like the top takeaway for me, and I think you drew a pretty stark line, is the failure on a regulatory level to really take this seriously.
Yo, yeah, absolutely. I mean, after the Satartia incident, they were like, the PHMSA was trying to sort of, in the Biden era, was trying to sort of update its regulations to really like acknowledge the specific hazards posed by carbon dioxide pipelines, especially as there's going to be this huge build out of these pipelines over the next couple decades. Like right now, there's only about 5,000 miles of pipeline nationwide. And by 2050, there could be as many as 70,000 miles of pipeline nationwide or more. So there's like specific hazards that needs to be addressed for these unique cases. Specifically, like one of the huge ones is getting better modeling. And this takes both like research and industry support. There's also a question of like contaminants in carbon dioxide pipelines. Like if you have water, it creates carbonic acid, which can corrode the like steel piping and then ultimately lead to more eruptions. There's also a question of like potentially converting natural gas infrastructure to then carry carbon dioxide. And some people don't want that to happen. The industry is pretty much in favor of it because it just makes things a lot cheaper for them. But there's unique considerations there that aren't currently regulated in any way, shape, or form. And then there's also like a concern about like mitigating what are called quote unquote geohazards. So like things like landslides. And
Mhm.
as we saw in 2020 with Satartia, like it was a landslide that caused that to happen because there was so much just like excess rain over the sort of
Yeah.
2 months leading up to the incident. And as, climate change progresses and we get more severe storms and just like extreme rainfall events, those
Hmm.
kinds of incidents become more regular and have a greater risk of happening. And so there needs to be more effort done to prevent those, but that also
Which
is
the
currently not regulated.
Yeah, and the Trump administration, I'm sure, was really enthusiastic about bringing heavy regulation to the industry
Oh,
and protecting the public health. Is that what you found?
the exact opposite, as you know. Yeah, I mean, immediately on January 20th, right, one of the sort of first executive orders among the like 100 plus that were signed that day, in January 20th, 2025, that is, was specifically like pausing effectively across the board all the different regulatory proposed rules that were in effect. And one of those was this PHMSA rule. And so it was just paused at that point and then totally removed and scrubbed from the PHMSA website entirely. Like it doesn't exist on the Federal Registrar anymore or anywhere in sort of PHMSA's material. And there's no discussion, as one of my sources was telling me from the Pipeline Safety Trust. It's just not even on the sort of radar or agenda for the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration
Yeah.
going forward. Like they're just not considering it at all.
And so, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, you've been writing stories sort of in this vein, and how did you get interested in why did you feel it was important to step in on a story like this, or what
Yeah.
else have you been working on similar?
I mean, yeah, as far as I guess my sort of career journey as a journalist, like I'm in my still fairly early in my career. And this is I've been in it now for 3 years, so this is in my like halfway through my like fourth year of doing journalism. And I came into this work actually in a somewhat roundabout way because I used to my degree is in like geophysics and earth sciences, so I have like a really like scientific and technical background. I spent some time working in the space tech industry, which is part of why like one of the stories that I wrote for Deceleration was specifically on like SpaceX and the hazards
That
posed
was
by.
so good. I'm going to
Yeah.
link that one too. That was
It was
really,
really
really good.
fun and really interesting that a lot of people are sort of like not aware of is like what's going to happen as SpaceX sort of ramps up a huge number of launches. We have Blue Origin doing this with similar goals and just like
Yeah.
pumping thousands, tens of thousands of satellites in the upper atmosphere. But yeah, so like I suppose space tech background helped inform that. But then after that, I jumped into sort of community organizing, community work, and did like climate activism and organizing in Seattle, where I live, um, and worked on Seattle's Green New Deal Oversight Board and was like their first co-chair, one of their first co-chairs, I guess, with one of my colleagues on the board and was just like learning a lot about climate solutions and have very much just like a solutions oriented lens about like wanting to figure out how we like really address the sort of like root causes of climate change and make sure that like we're mitigating as much as we possibly can of like the worst possible outcomes.
Yeah.
And through that, like then thinking about like what kind of solutions make the most sense when we're thinking about root causes, like the sort of community level solutions that come up and the alternatives that we have to pursue to the sort of like status quo. I was just learning a lot more about these, as you mentioned, quote unquote, false solutions and the sort of like challenges that they pose, and also like to some degree, the promises that they have. Because as like one of my sources for this particular story on carbon pipelines pointed out, and as I've like learned about through other reporting that I've done on like different quote unquote carbon removal options and strategies is like if we're I mean even at this point to sort of meet our Paris goal of 2 degrees Celsius, which is like increasingly growing out of reach, but like if we want to reach that, we do have to do some amount of carbon removal from the atmosphere and
Hmm.
carbon capture, especially with these like what are called hard to decarbonize industries of like steel production.
Hmm.
Um, and even like paper mills and paper products and whatnot, like those are really hard to stop emitting. And so to some degree, you literally just have to capture carbon and store it underground. And so the question then becomes like, if this is necessary, like how do we do it in the safest way possible
Hmm.
and ensure that like folks who are communities who are already on the front lines of emissions and pollution from these different industries are, treated with the respect and dignity that they deserve, and simultaneously aren't exposed to new hazards, which unfortunately has not been the case so far.
Mhm.
With these different kinds of solutions, and likely with the way that carbon pipelines are currently proposed, will like most likely continue to be the case, in that they will be continually exposed to new hazards, because most of these 69,000 miles of pipeline that are proposed for carbon capture are likely going to go through low income communities, black and brown
Right.
communities, and rural areas that are already just like continually getting left by the wayside,
Yeah.
um, as society marches forward.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard not to grow absolutely cynical.
Yeah,
When we see, even as technologies develop that can lead us through kind of what people discuss as sort of a just transition if we chose one, right?
right.
But they ultimately are just folded into business as usual
Yeah,
and don't do any good, right? In that
right.
context, where we're just expanding all of the above. So it's really hard. We've got to fight against cynicism,
Yeah,
at the same time fight against, bad policy. So yeah,
100%.
thank you for that. Now we've been talking about this for a little while, and I don't know if this podcast will come out first or if the newsletters will drop first, but I wanted to, kind of the last thing I had in mind for our brief kind of conversation was to talk about what's coming next. And I know you've got a new newsletter kind of envisioned, and we're working out the finer maybe details of what's the landscape, who we're talking to, and all that. But if you would just kind of, share that with listeners,
Yeah.
so they know what to look forward to.
Happy to, for sure. Um, yeah, there is, well, as you mentioned, like these sort of suite of newsletters that Deceleration is pursuing to really bring, consistent coverage on different, like highly important areas that are ongoing. And I have the great fortune of writing the Alternative Futures newsletter, and sort of taking my background in both solutions reporting and climate activism and organizing to look at the like really transformative ideas that grassroots communities in the United States and potentially around the world are really pursuing to address what I and others in these communities see as really the truly like root causes of the climate crisis, of mass extinction, and these other sort of converging crises are affecting people, and how we like address them. And so that's things like, like over extractions of resources, like hyper consumption, just like this huge competitiveness that's sort of baked into capitalism, and how we sort of shift to new economies and new ways of living and being and relating to ourselves, our landscapes and whatnot. And yeah, I'm really excited about it. I mean, before sort of halfway through my like journalism journey so far, I had the chance to work at Grist, a legacy climate newsroom that's been around since 2000, writing about climate change and all the sort of surrounding topics. And last in 2024, I was their climate solutions fellow, and one of my favorite like types of stories to pursue was just really like looking at specifically what communities are doing to help usher in this transition, this just transition, specifically to take us from this like very extractive economy that, encloses wealth, that causes greed and hyper consumerism, and has this like quote unquote linear economy where we're extracting stuff, consuming it, and then just throwing it away, whether it ends up in a landfill or the ocean or where have you, to something, transitioning to something that's a more regenerative, more living economy, where we're cooperating with each other, where we center care and kindness and respect, and where we have a sort of like circular approach to our economy, where we're not necessarily extracting as many resources and throwing things away, but we're repairing them, and we're reusing different parts for new applications, or quote unquote upcycling, as some people say in different contexts. And there's so many exciting things that are happening in that space, and new ideas that are constantly being pursued and experimented with. Um, and like each community is going to have its own unique challenges and unique solutions that are going to come up. So it's just really exciting to see explore some of this for deceleration readers, and give a little bit of hope at a time of genuine, utter despair,
Yeah.
where things feel increasingly difficult and climate solutions feel increasingly unlikely. But even in the face of all that, there's just like so many exciting things that are happening, where they're just like addressing these like key problems. I mean, there's like one story that I'm thinking of that I really enjoyed writing for Grist was specifically about like this sort of shift to electric vehicles and a new approach to transportation, right? Where ideally, from just like a bare I don't know, accounting perspective, if you will, like the ideal solution to transportation problems is just like building out mass infrastructure, like mass transportation, new buses, light rail, subways, etc. But that's really difficult to do in the United States, both because of like costs and permitting and whatnot. Um, and because we have constructed our cities and suburbs in such a way that like they're so car dependent. Like it's really difficult to get around in certain areas without a car. And so people shift towards ownership, but there's obviously so much coverage around like cobalt mining and all these different like lithium mining as well, and the extraction of the materials required for batteries, that it's pretty clear that if you had like a one-to-one shift from combustion engines to electric vehicles, that that would not really solve a lot of these other problems that come up with that. But there's a lot of cool efforts, and I wrote about one specifically in like California, where people are doing electric vehicle car sharing programs. And so instead of having for a community one car for every person, you might have one car for every 10 people because not everyone's going to use the car at the same time. And it's specifically targeting rural areas in California where you need to have a car to get to healthcare appointments, to do your groceries, what have you. And it's just been this really like tremendous grassroots led effort. So covering that kind of stuff and other things like solar cooperatives or different approaches to like mutual aid and whatnot. And I wrote a story recently for a local outlet here in Seattle about like farmers collectives and cooperatives that are like taking this new approach to a local food system. That's really both regenerative, hyper local, low cost, really nutritious foods. Um, and it's just like great to see that kind of stuff that people are pursuing for these really like key areas of nourishing people. And then not only do they solve problems that are important for climate change, but they also just like foster community and connection and cohesiveness, and just like nourish the spirit in that way.
Yeah, I'm just so excited for this project. I'm excited for your enthusiasm and your
Yeah.
knowledge and just the work that people are doing. I know that, because this is part of our challenge and our charge at Deceleration, and some of the most interesting organizing projects talk about, we don't just, fight and beat back the bad. You have to grow alternatives. You have to, be growing and building new things. And I know, like, for myself, we were talking earlier, but for myself, it's like I don't always get to that next step because there's so much bad stuff happening. So I thought, even though all of our writers are, continue to look to these spaces, look into community for solutions for alternative futures, I think it's important also to have a dedicated space. It's like, look, we're going to do it even if we're overwhelmed, even if we're distraught,
Yeah.
even if we're angry, fearful, whatever else is happening. Um, because the nature of, authoritarianism, of fascism, is to insist upon one future, right? One correct way of thinking, one way of being. White supremacy is all about that as well.
Mhm.
And the earth. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Just if you look at the way the planet functions and has dressed herself, and this complexity of design and diversity of expression, it's like it's an irrepressible force, right?
For
And I
sure.
think people doing that are simply participating in that in that project.
Yeah.
It cannot be tamped down.
Oh, absolutely, for sure. And I do think like especially when we're dealing with this like rise of authoritarianism and fascism in the United States, like it just takes it causes so much despair and anger and discomfort, and it's really difficult to sustain any sort of resistance in the face of these terrors, frankly, if there's not some sort of semblance of hope, frankly, at the end. And there's a lot of people that I see on social media and elsewhere that talk about this idea of hope. And I often see it framed in sort of like puff piece way about
Right.
like, look at these different things that are happening and there's still
Right.
some joy you can find in the world. And like, I mean, I've written about this for my own like sort of personal blog, if you will, where like I just don't see that as being the sort of true meaningful hope that people need because it's also framed in a way that's fairly like um, uh, in a way that doesn't allow for agency, where it's just like this stuff is happening and it doesn't afford the, I don't know, idea of thinking about how do I get involved in helping to create this kind of change or create these implement these solutions locally and think about that. And it doesn't look at the people and the sort of process that
Mhm.
that change requires. So yeah, there's a need for that kind of hope and not just being like, here's some cool things that are happening,
Let me
but
distract you with something that's,
exactly,
infinitely less likely than the violence you see immediately in your neighborhood, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, getting away from that distraction to think about more about inspiration and giving people like clear like action steps and inspiration that they can truly take
Mhm.
and see how they can implement that locally. Um, yeah.
Well, I'm going to say this to all of the writers that are included in this podcast. Hopefully I catch everybody. We may not catch everybody, but I mean, you are absolutely, I think, just in this conversation confirming the perfect person. I'm so, excited to be partnered on this project with you, that you're
Yeah.
leading this effort. And I'm just, for everything that's aligned sort of against us, if you would. I mean, there's a real need for designing and insisting on, other ways of being. So thank you for agreeing to be that person with us.
My pleasure. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be a great time, and I'm looking forward to collaborating with you and everyone else, frankly, that's going to be building out newsletters and columns for Deceleration 2.0.
Awesome.